Well, there's been quite a stir, and everybody's limped to their corners and licking their wounds, wondering how they'll deal with those who they wish to engage with and be friends with who disagree with them. Throwing jabs at each other. I'm just seeing the Facebook whiplash and the posts, which are interesting. I saw my friend CJ. I didn't listen to the whole thing, but basically the title, I mean, I haven't watched it yet, but I'm guessing that it says something like, you have to be a Calvinist or you're an open theist, and you all know what open theism means. You're a heretic. But as I've talked to open theists and argued against it myself, and I'm not an open theist in the sense that people are meaning it, I guess. But then when I talk to open theists, suddenly I realized they've been characterized in a lot of ways, because a lot of them do believe some weird stuff that would definitely be quote unquote heretical, I guess. But let me just say it this way. If you mean, it's kind of like this. Sometimes I tell people, the apostles were Seventh-day Adventists, right? They didn't believe in the investigative judgment, you idiot. You're insane. Why are you lying to people? Oh, you must be evil. You want to lie to people to believe that you're heresy. And it's like, no. And I don't think they didn't have the gospel until 1863 either, like some idiots say in their bad criticisms, their misrepresentation. When I say the apostles were Seventh-day Adventists, I mean they expected the advent of Christ, the return of Jesus. That's what Adventist means. And then they kept the Sabbath, like a good commandment keeping believer does. So they were Seventh-day Adventists. Were they members of a church started in 1863? Obviously not. So just like if you believe in the second coming, you're an Adventist. But that's how terms get. This is just how terminology works, right? So open theism. Are open theists heretics? Well, it depends. Because sometimes the discussion is really stems from, as I understand it, that open means not predetermined. Closed means predetermined. So am I an open theist in that sense? Well, yeah. I don't think God determined me to, I don't think God determines people to accidentally get drunk or purposely get drunk and hit a biker on the side of the road. God didn't determine that. This is why we have words that Calvinists accidentally use sometimes, like allowance, permission. And we don't have to know how that works. We don't have to be able to explain everything, because after all, yeah, if I had enough power, like a super duper, just unbelievable amount of power, yeah, I could be God with enough power and computing power behind me and enough force to monitor everything how I wanted it to go. So if I had enough power, and with my human brain, you could devise a giant computer with AI robots that could enforce your will on everything, or set up everything in such a way that it sets everybody up to do exactly what you want it to be. You just need enough power and energy. A human mind could do that. And that's exactly what I think is going on. I'm sorry that, knowledge isn't the same thing as determinism, but I think the Calvinist is essentially saying the only way I can imagine this, and everybody else is saying, no, God sees what man will do. Does he look down the corridors of time? Well, only if you look in Calvinist literature critiquing what other people believe will you see that kind of language. But no one actually uses those terms. The point is to emphasize the knowledge is not based on determinism. It's something else, and we can speculate about that. In fact, we don't even have to know. We just have to know that God seems to know, and whether or not we can explain how that works doesn't demand that we believe God determined everything, including all evil, despicable acts that he seems to condemn and distance himself very, very clearly. Now, are there verses you can muster in the Bible to suggest a deterministic sort of thing? Perhaps, But there's understandings of those texts to suggest that that's not what it's saying. And so because I see God distancing himself from evil, and I see God communicating justice to us through the Torah, I cannot get on board with such an idea. That's why I would use it. If I'm gonna say God knows and then he creates, then I'm gonna use terms like allowance and permission. Because I feel pressed by the text to do that, because I feel the necessity of what I understand about justice and mitigating circumstances and responsibility. That necessitates me to deny God determines evil just because he knows it. And I feel like the Calvinists want to like pressure people to say, oh, that can't be, it just doesn't work. You're not saying knowledge is determinism, but you're saying God knows because he determined, and because God determined, he knows. You are tying those concepts together and saying there's no other way. Or the text is demanding because of other texts, but I think those are weak interpretations that are not necessary. And there's other texts to suggest otherwise. And if people don't want to recognize that everyone has a lens to which they read all their texts through, that tends to make you read it a certain way, and you're not honest about the fact that language works that way, it may be silly. And we all probably do that because we want to argue for our understanding. If open theism means God can't know the future, I'm not that. If open theism means the future is truly open to my choices and God didn't choose ahead of time that those things which I do that are evil so that I have to do them by necessity, then yes, of course I am that. If that means I'm an open theist, I'm an open theist. But I still think God knows the future, and I don't care that I can't explain that. You can't explain why God isn't guilty for determining all evil things by necessity. That just seems blatantly the case. So I'm going to go with that mystery, because I think even you have to say God is free to make choices. And that means some sort of agency is real. And if I think God has it, then I can trust that he has endowed us to have that in some limited sense. And that's my theodicy, that he did in fact do that. And I still believe he's absolutely sovereign and he has rules of engagement, and that's his business. But closed theism is where God determines evil in such a way that it's a necessity, is unbiblical and hopelessly guilty of making God something other than who he has revealed himself to be, particularly as demonstrated in Jesus. We don't have to explain how that works. We all operate, we all have that intuition, unless we've drilled it out of ourselves. But even those who have done so, and I believe you when you say that that's not your intuition, but what seems to be the case is that you do operate as though that's true. When you get cut off, you get mad because you think the person could have and should have done differently. You still punish your children and look at them as though they could have done differently. And the more you feel like they have the ability to do something differently, the more you're probably going to be upset with the fact that they did it. And because of how we how we give sentencing in court cases based on circumstances, seems like justice, doesn't it? It's the reason we don't, the Torah doesn't make a rape victim who's committed adultery punishable like the rapist is, like the rapist would be. But we do give, because they were forced into it, but they committed the act. But if all acts are committed by necessity of God's determining, and he still punishes people for what he's determined, that person, that rape victim, still committed adultery if they were, there was unmarried person. What's the difference? Intention, responsibility is the difference, because they could have done differently, but the victim could. Oh, but God's still determining that, and it's still that one was doing it by their own free will and one was forced against their will. See, now that's guilty of, or that's worthy of seeing a difference about between the victim. Okay, but yeah, as a sham, if God can punish the sinner who couldn't do otherwise because they did it by their own free will, which God determined, and that's still punishable because they did what they wanted to do, then Calvinists should be for banning all guns, because a trigger puller isn't necessarily guilty. The gun did what it was made to do. The gun is guilty. God speaks things into existence. Do we believe that God did that? He says he did. We can't even begin to explain how that could work. Yet, we believe that. Do we have to understand it? No. What we do understand is that let me read this verse. You're never going to get people to believe that God's off the hook. And in fact, the funny thing about that is the whole enterprise of compatibilism is trying to get God off the hook, but it's failing because it's still determinism. If an ox gores a man or a woman and they die, the ox shall be put to death. And you will not eat his flesh, but the owner of the ox shall be quit. But if the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past, and it has been testified to his owner, and he didn't keep him in, but that he has killed the man or woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owner shall also be put to death. How are we going to get God off the hook? Putting that bull into the china shop, knowing ahead of time. I'm not sure. But in some way, we have to say, I think we have to say that God is not guilty of the same thing as what the Torah says. If the owner knew what was going to happen to the person, or that he had an ox that had done this sort of thing before and he didn't keep it in, and he's been warned. In other words, if you have a rabid dog and you don't put it down and it kills somebody else, that owner shall be put to death. This is an open question. I'm not saying I have an answer or I'm proving anything. I'm saying, how are you gonna? The idea would be that the owner is guilty and has to be put to death, having known that his beast was dangerous. If that's been testified and he doesn't keep that animal away from people and it gets out and it kills somebody, the owner of the ox is to be put to death. Now, that's an animal. We're humans, right? But it just does what it's going to do, right? But he's guilty of it because that's so. The only way you get God off the hook is by recognizing the difference between animals. God isn't guilty in the same way, whether he knew or not. Whether you think he knew, I think he did know. I think it's clear in the text. You can show that God knew what was going to happen. But why is God not guilty? Because we're not determined. Animals are determined. They don't have the same capacity as humans. That's the difference. And it's a serious difference because God has said, come, let us reason together. And that's a principle. And he said, I'm giving you my Torah so you know justice and mercy and righteousness and responsibility. So it's real responsibility. You're obliged to keep that ox in. If a man has an ox that's gored someone in the past and he doesn't keep it in, he's put to death, God did not determine that that man relinquished his animal and that a person was killed. God did not invent the crack pipe in your hand when you're smoking it. God didn't do that. You did that. It's you. You have that magical power to do or not to do. And it's intuitively obvious, and we all live and breathe and operate on that principle. And we get disgusted because of injustice. And we have mercy based on circumstances. That's clearly what the Bible is operating under. Now, I'm going to live within that framework. If every time a verse seems to suggest free will, your excuse is, well, yeah, because that's the narrative. God is telling that story that way. No, God is part of that story. And if he's written the story in that way, that it operates that way, and we all naturally have those natural inclinations to operate that way and to respond that way and to engage in a world with disgust and praise and blameworthiness and responsibility and disappointment and praise, then I'm going to live like that's true because the Bible is the source of my worldview. I'm not going to place something on top of that. Yeah, but God's really just determining all that. No. There's nothing in the text that tells me to do that. Only things that tell me the opposite. And that's why theodicy only makes sense that God is the redeemer of what an enemy has done. Enemy has done this, God, Jesus says. Jesus says, whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, that cause of that person should have a millstone necklace placed around their neck, and they should be cast into the sea. I thought you sowed the good seed, Master. Where did these bad seed come from? Don't pluck them up, wait till the end of the age. I will deal with that. An enemy has done this. An enemy. God's dealing with an enemy. It's not a power struggle. It's a character struggle. God is demonstrating who he is to his children. And God doesn't just take out his enemies because he's so powerful and he just wants to show off his power. Think about how ridiculous that is. God needs to show off his power to people that already understand him to have power, all power, to consider him omniscient or omnipotent. We already all believe God can do whatever he wants. Everybody does. Why doesn't he? Why do he need to demonstrate some sort of control power? No, he wants to demonstrate his character of love. And that requires dissenters to make their case and for him to demonstrate, because he wants to demonstrate otherwise, that their accusations are false. And that's what the devil's doing. He's accusing God of being unjust. And the obvious reason that is absolutely right is demonstrated by the ministry and sacrifice and teaching of Jesus Christ.